That uniform is a costume for killers. The protester's voice cracked with fury as he hurled a can of bright red paint, a streak of color slicing through the air until it burst against the chest of Master Sergeant Harold Red Becker. He didn't move, didn't speak. The paint ran down his metals, staining years of service, soaking into the crisp lines of his perfectly pressed blues. The crowd gasped. A city official reached forward, but Red Becker simply closed his eyes for a moment, as if honoring someone only he could still hear. Behind him, confusion, rage. The protester grinned. And that's when the old Marine opened his flip phone. Not to call the police, but something older. Moments later, the streets began to shake. And when the Marines arrived, they didn't come with speeches. They came with boots, steel, and silence. Harold Red Becker didn't need to remind anyone he was a Marine. You could see it in the way he walked upright, deliberate, like every step still meant something. At 74, his shoulders remained squared, his boots polished, and his ease steady. The years had grayed his hair and slowed his stride, but the discipline of a lifetime in uniform still lived in his bones. He lived alone in a modest, single-story brick home just outside Kerrville, Texas. No plaques on the walls, no flags out front, just a tidy porch, a porch swing he rarely used, and a Marine Corps decal on the mailbox that had faded with time. His house, like the man himself, didn't ask for attention. But those who knew the town knew exactly who Harold Red Becker was. He wasn't the kind to talk about his medals unless someone asked. And even then he downplayed them like they were just souvenirs. But the truth was, Harold had seen more than most. 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 deployments in the Gulf, a Bronze Star with Valor, a Purple Heart he kept in a small wooden box beside a worn photograph of the men he lost. And that nickname Red wasn't for his hair, it was for a mission where he dragged 2 wounded Marines out of a firefight, soaked head to toe in blood by the time the bird touched down. After retiring, Harold didn't vanish into the quiet. He showed up. Every week at the high school to mentor the ROTC kids, every Sunday at the local VFW hall, and every holiday that mattered: Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Independence Day. He was there in his full-dress blues medals, polished shoes shining like mirrors. He always said it wasn't for him. It was for the ones who didn't get the chance to wear it again. Though his knees ached from years underweight and his right hip never healed right after a crash during a training exercise in Okinawa, he never complained. He walked every wreath to the base of the memorial himself, steady, silent, and without a cane. The town never asked him to do it. He just did. Harold Becker was one of those men who quietly held a community together. You wouldn't know it unless you watched closely, but if you did, you'd see. Every young Marine who left that town shook his hand before they deployed. And when they came back, the first stop wasn't always family, it was often Harold's porch. Because respect recognizes its own. Maplewood Park wasn't much, just a patch of green, nestled behind City Hall, with a few benches, a line of flagpoles, and a modest granite memorial etched with names of local sons and daughters who never made it home. But on Veterans Day, that little park became sacred ground. By mid-morning, folding chairs had been set up. The high school band, dressed in mismatched maroon blazers, stood ready with their brass instruments glinting in the Texas sun. A line of veterans, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, sat in the front row. Behind them, families gathered holding small flags, many wearing ball caps that quietly spoke of units long gone. At the center of it all stood Harold Red Becker, his uniform crisp and flawless. The brass buttons gleamed, his ribbons perfectly aligned, and his posture held with the kind of dignity you can't teach. He wasn't one for speeches, but today he'd agreed to be the honored guest. He said he didn't feel right about it, but everyone else did. The mayor had insisted. Even the high school principal, whose father had served with Harold back in '68, showed up to shake his hand. The mayor gave a short welcome reading from a crumpled sheet of paper, trying his best to strike the right tone. The band played America the Beautiful, a little out of tune but full of heart. Then came the prayer, the roll call of the fallen, and finally the laying of the wreath. That's when the shouting started. A group of maybe a dozen protesters had gathered just beyond the iron fence. Their signs were bold. War is an honor. No more blood for power. Uniforms are not sacred. A few of them wore masks, others held smartphones high, already filming. Their chants rose up loud, angry, but just shy of crossing the line. The police kept a wary distance, their presence polite but clearly uneasy. Harold didn't react. He stood still, eyes forward, gloved hands clasped behind his back. but the tension in the crowd was rising. A young mother pulled her child closer. One of the older veterans whispered something under his breath. The high school band stopped playing, and the silence that followed was more fragile than reverent. Everyone sensed it. Something was shifting. You could feel it in the air, like the sky just before a storm. Most hoped it would pass, that the group would shout themselves hoarse and leave. But Harold had been in enough battles to know when something was about to break. And in that moment, he knew they weren't done yet. The notes of taps hung gently in the November air, slow and mournful. The bugler stood near the memorial stone, his cheeks puffed with each breath, the tune echoing off the silent crowd. Flags barely fluttered. Even the protest group had fallen mostly quiet, as if the sacred sound held them back for a moment. Then from the far edge of the fence, something shifted. A figure stepped forward from the protest group. Younger than the rest, probably no more than 25. Black hoodie, sharp jaw, eyes that burned not with grief but with rage. He pushed past a fellow protester who tried to grab his arm, but the young man shook him off and kept moving, crossing the small lawn toward the wreath-laying platform. Security, such as it was, consisted of 2 older city volunteers in bright orange vests. They were slow to register what was happening. No one expected trouble during taps. The protester walked with purpose. In his hand, mostly hidden beneath his sleeve, was a small metal can familiar to anyone who'd ever painted a wall. The bugler played on, unaware. The young man didn't yell at first. He waited until he was just a few feet from the memorial, close enough that the sharp smell of shoe polish and autumn leaves mingled in the air. Then, loud enough to cut through the final haunting note of taps, he screamed, "That uniform is a murderer's costume." Heads turned. The mayor's mouth dropped. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey," but it was too late. With a violent flick of his wrist, the protester hurled the can. It flipped once in the air and then burst open its contents, arcing forward in a thick, wet ribbon of red. It struck Harold square in the chest. The paint hit with a slap and a splash, exploding across his jacket, streaking through his ribbons, dripping onto the leather of his belt, and soaking the hem of his coat. The vivid crimson ran down his buttons and pooled on the polished toes of his black dress shoes. The metals he had polished by hand that morning now clung to his chest beneath a thick coat of dripping insult. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. A child started crying. One of the veterans let out a growl. The mayor stood paralyzed, hand halfway raised. Several audience members reached for their phones, already capturing it. But Harold didn't move. He stood there, eyes still forward, posture locked in attention. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. Not even to wipe the cold red liquid running down his neck. Instead, he closed his eyes just for a moment. It wasn't weariness. It was something deeper. Memory, maybe. Or mourning. As if he were hearing voices the rest of the world had long forgotten. Names not carved in stone but carried in blood. The protester, emboldened, raised both fists and shouted, "No more killers in uniform." He was already backing away when the 2 elderly security volunteers finally rushed forward. The protester let them grab him. He didn't resist. He just smiled like a man who believed he'd won something. All around them, silence rippled like a wave. The bugler lowered his trumpet. The city officials looked helpless. The veterans on the front row were rising slowly from their chairs, fury brewing in their eyes. Harold moved for the first time. Not to shout, not to fight. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out something odd for the modern world. A gray scratched military-issued flip phone, one of the old models with a black and white screen and a stubby antenna. A relic of a different era. He flipped it open, pressed one button, held it to his ear. No one around him knew who he was calling. But in that moment, those who saw the expression on Harold Becker's face knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The small gray flip phone clicked open with a familiar, satisfying snap. Harold hadn't used it in years, not since his last reunion with the Corps during a joint training exercise down at Camp Lejeune. It wasn't for casual conversation. In fact, it didn't even have a regular number, just a secured military line routed through a protocol known only to a handful of living veterans. It was never meant to be used lightly. His thumb hovered for half a second. Then he pressed and held the only button that mattered. The line didn't ring. No hold music. No call center cues. Just a short tone. And then a voice calm, clipped and unmistakably military. U.S. Command Liaison. Identification. Harold's voice was firm, though low. Master Sergeant Harold Becker. Code Alpha 74. Retired status. He took a shallow breath. Reporting protocol breach. Veteran ceremony. Public assault on uniform. Civilians present. Local security ineffective. There was a pause on the other end. A breath. Then understood. Confirm intent. Harold's tone didn't waver. Honor compromised. That was the phrase, the old trigger. The one saved for the rarest of calls when a veteran stood alone, and the symbols they wore were defiled in public. Not for vengeance, not for optics, but because some things were sacred. And when they were threatened, the Corps still answered. Location Maplewood Park, Kerrville, Texas, civilian presence high, suspect in custody, civil unrest possible. The line shifted. Keys clacked in the background. Then the voice returned, no longer, just procedural. Master Sergeant Becker. This is Major Elias Tolland, Active Liaison Command, 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. We're on training ops less than 20 miles east. We're moving now. Harold blinked quietly, absorbing the reply. How many assets, he asked. Tolland didn't hesitate. Sufficient to ensure presence, protection, and principle. ETA under 10 minutes. You'll know when we arrive. Harold nodded to himself, though no one else could hear. Appreciate the speed. You called it Master Sergeant. We just answer. The line went dead. No goodbyes, no debriefs. Harold closed the flip phone slowly and slid it back into the pocket of his paint-stained jacket. Around him, the ceremony site was still frozen. The protester now sat cuffed on the curb, flanked by overwhelmed volunteers and a lone city officer calling for backup. The mayor was speaking in hushed tones with a councilwoman gesturing helplessly at the stained memorial wreath. The crowd had broken into clusters, some angry, some confused, all rattled. But Harold, he just stood still. The silence had changed. It wasn't stunned anymore. It was waiting. And in that stillness, only Harold knew what was coming. Because he hadn't called for help. He had called for honor. And that meant something very specific in the world he once walked in uniform. It meant boots. It meant steel. It meant the Marines were on the way. At first, it was just a distant hum, like thunder rolling low across the hill country sky. Most people didn't even notice it. The crowd still buzzed with confusion and outrage. A few tried to comfort Harold. Others argued with the city officials. But Harold Becker didn't say a word. He had already made his call. Now he was simply waiting. Then the hum grew louder, rhythmic, methodical, familiar to some ears. Two children stopped playing and looked up. Above the rooftops of downtown Kerrville, the sky shifted. A pair of dark shapes broke through the clouds, two Marine UH-1Y helicopters, flying low in deliberate rotors, slicing through the morning air. They didn't circle. They didn't hover. They announced. Within seconds, traffic lights swung, papers lifted from park benches, and every set of eyes turned skyward. Then came the convoy. From every major street feeding into the downtown square, tactical vehicles began appearing. Not police SUVs, not National Guard pickups, but Marine Corps hardware. The kind of vehicles most people only saw in documentaries or foreign deployments. MRAPs, Humvees, LAV-25s, engines growling low tires like steel fists rolling over pavement. They didn't come with sirens. They didn't need to. Within 8 minutes of Harold's call, the entire landscape of the town had changed. City buses pulled over. Civilian drivers stopped and stepped out. Storefront owners came outside with phones in hand. The sound of boots on concrete followed the rumble rows of Marines in full combat utilities, helmeted vests strapped tight, each carrying a service rifle in patrol-ready posture. Barrels pointed low but unmistakably present. One by one they spread out. Systematic, professional, calm. They didn't shout. They didn't gesture wildly. They simply formed a circle of presence, blocking the park from every angle, establishing a security perimeter around the memorial, the wreaths, the crowd. No one had to be told what was happening. Even the police who had tried to manage the chaos earlier instinctively stepped back. A sergeant from the Kerrville Police Department approached the leading Marine officer, her voice uncertain, her hands up in a signal of cooperation. "Sir, we weren't informed of this." The Marine simply nodded. "We're not here to interfere, ma'am. We're here to protect what's already been assaulted." She understood and stepped aside. The protesters, once loud, smug, and defiant, now stood motionless, their signs lowered, their chants silenced. Even those who had mocked the uniform were now staring at it, surrounded by 360 degrees of unwavering muscle. The young man who'd thrown the paint had long since been taken away, but the consequences of his act were just beginning to unfold. No one ran, no one screamed. This wasn't an invasion, it wasn't punishment, it was presence. It was a reminder that the United States Marine Corps doesn't forget its own retired or active, and it doesn't take disrespect lightly, especially not on a day meant to honor the fallen. Harold Becker remained where he was standing, tall in his stained blues, as the ring of Marines tightened gently around him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that moment, the entire town understood something that couldn't be put into words. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about revenge. This was about a single truth. Some symbols don't fall quietly, and some men don't stand alone. The ground seemed as still as the final vehicle in the convoy came to a halt at the edge of Maplewood Park. From the back of a matte black Marine MRAP, a man emerged with the kind of presence that required no introduction. Colonel Jonathan McCade was not a politician. He wasn't there for optics. Every movement he made was deliberate, from the way he adjusted his gloves to how he surveyed the perimeter. The eagle globe and anchor insignia on his chest caught the morning light as he strode through the line of Marines with the silent authority of a man who had led through real fire. When he reached the center of the memorial, Colonel McCade stopped facing Harold Becker, whose jacket still bore the bright red stain down the center of his medals and lapels. Without a word, McCade stood at attention and offered a salute impeccable sharp and held just a moment longer than regulation. Harold, with the same slow, deliberate dignity, returned it. Then the colonel spoke not to Harold directly, but to the entire gathering. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried with the weight of granite. This uniform is not a target. It is a legacy. It represents the service and sacrifice of every man and woman who stood when others ran, who bled so that others wouldn't have to, and who kept their oath long after the war was over. When you strike at one of us, you strike at all of us. He paused, letting the words settle. Then turning toward the crowd, he continued. This community gathered today to honor its veterans. What happened here, this act of violence and disgrace, will not go unanswered. Not by this Corps, not on this soil, not today. At that moment, one of the Marine officers approached and handed the colonel a report. He glanced at it, then looked toward the officers managing the suspect across the street. The protester who committed the assault is now in custody. He will face formal charges, including assault and hate-based enhancement, for targeting a uniformed veteran in a ceremonial setting. The protest group, which had thinned considerably since the arrival of the Marines, released a statement almost immediately, one of their members reading it aloud shakily to a local reporter's camera. We do not condone violence or personal attacks. This individual acted alone, and his actions do not reflect our values. It was too little too late. Their credibility had cracked, along with the silence they'd shattered earlier that morning. Meanwhile, Mayor Gilbreth, red-faced and visibly shaken, took the podium hastily set up at the edge of the ceremony space. With sweat on his brow and notes trembling in his hands, he faced the crowd. On behalf of the city of Caryville, I want to issue a public apology to Master Sergeant Becker, to every veteran here today, and to the United States Marine Corps. We failed to protect this sacred space. It will not happen again. He looked at Harold, then stepped back with nothing more to say. No one clapped, no one cheered. The silence was more powerful, because some moments demand solemnity, and this was a reckoning. By nightfall, the footage had been shared over 4 million times. Someone in the crowd had captured the exact moment the paint hit Harold Becker's chest. Another video caught the helicopter slicing through the air just minutes later. And by the time the Marines had formed their silent perimeter around Maplewood Park, at least 5 live streams were broadcasting from cell phones held by stunned onlookers. The story spread like wildfire. Headlines lit up social media. Veteran doused in paint Marines respond in force. Honor compromised, how a small town witnessed a big moment protester targets Marine. What happened next shocked the nation. Cable news channels rolled clips of Colonel McCade's short, sharp statement. His words, "The uniform is not a target, it is a legacy," became an instant soundbite. Talk shows debated it. Pundits argued over constitutional rights, the military's response, the symbolism of protest, and the meaning of honor. The conversation split the country. On one side, civil rights advocates warned of government overreach and the militarization of civic space. On the other, veterans, military families, and supporters pointed to a deeper cultural wound, an erosion of respect for those who had served, no matter the politics behind the wars they fought. Twitter became a battlefield. You can't just storm a town with tanks because someone got offended. He didn't get offended. He got assaulted in full uniform on Veterans Day. There's a difference. Free speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence. He stood there and took it, like a Marine. And he made one call. That's not violence. That's dignity. Veterans groups began flooding social media with their own posts, photos of dress uniforms, stories of sacrifice, messages of support for Harold Becker. Many of them signed from one old Marine to another. Some shared personal reflections. In '72, someone spit on my uniform at the airport. I didn't fight back either. I just walked on. Wish Harold Becker had been there then. Sergeant Glenn Hart Rhett, Semper Fi, Master Sergeant. You reminded us all that sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the biggest weight. Latour College's Dana Maxwell. Still, through all the noise, Harold stayed quiet. He declined every interview request from national media to local radio. CNN camped outside his home for a day, but his porch light stayed off. He refused the attention. To him, it wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about being a symbol. It was about one thing: protecting what mattered. The only appearance he agreed to make was at the local VFW post. That Friday night, with no cameras present and only folding chairs, in a room lined with fading black and white photos, Harold stepped up to the microphone. He didn't read a statement. He didn't deliver a speech. He just looked out at the room full of men and women who had seen the same things he had and said, "They say the world's changing. Maybe it is. But honor doesn't change. And as long as one of us remembers what that uniform stands for, then they haven't erased a thing." Then he sat back down, folded his hands, and listened while the room rose to its feet in silence. The story didn't fade after the headlines moved on. If anything, Harold Becker's quiet defiance and the response it triggered became something larger, a turning point, not just for one town in Texas, but for how the country viewed its relationship with those who wore the uniform. Within weeks of the incident at Maplewood Park, a bipartisan bill was introduced in Congress, the Veterans Public Honor Protection Act. It aimed to provide stricter penalties for assaults on uniformed veterans during official commemorative events, while also ensuring local municipalities had the resources to provide proper security during high-risk holidays like Veterans Day and Memorial Day. The bill didn't come from a think tank or a lobbyist. It came from a small-town mayor's public apology and a veteran's quiet stand. And it passed the House with overwhelming support. At the state level, something just as meaningful began to take shape. A coalition of veterans groups launched a grassroots program called Honor Watch. The idea was simple: create a network of volunteer veterans across the country who would attend public ceremonies, not to monitor, not to intimidate, but to stand together, to support one another, to be visible reminders that no one who served should ever stand alone at the foot of a memorial. Every volunteer received a red pin etched with a single word: remember. The first Honor Watch chapter was based right in Kerrville. Harold Becker didn't ask to lead it, but they named him honorary captain anyway. Every year since rain or shine, a small formation of former Marine soldiers, airmen, and sailors gather behind the memorial at Maplewood Park. They don't say much. They don't need to. Sometimes presence is enough. And perhaps the most touching tribute didn't come from politicians or Marines, it came from the town's kids. After the incident, the city noticed that the paint on the park's granite memorial had begun to fade. Names were hard to read. Time had taken its toll. Quietly, without fanfare, the local middle school art teacher organized a weekend repainting effort. Dozens of students, many of whom had been there the day of the protest, showed up with brushes and stencils. Some brought their parents. A few wore ROTC caps. They weren't told what to write. But when it was done, just beneath the stone engraving of "Freedom is Never Free," they'd added one simple line in gold paint: "We saw him stand. We won't forget." That phrase would go on to be printed on bumper stickers, coffee mugs, and memorial plaques sent to VFW posts around the country. But in Kerrville, it remained handwritten, unpolished, imperfect, and somehow more sacred that way. Harold Becker never claimed to be a hero, but by standing still in the face of disrespect, he sparked something no protest ever could: A return to something old, something quiet, something called honor. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Harold Becker returned to Maplewood Park. The sky was overcast, the breeze soft, rustling the flags that now flew a little prouder along the stone path. There was no ceremony this time, no band or podium, just the old Marine walking alone. But he didn't come empty-handed. He wore a brand new set of dress blues sent directly from the Commandant's office at Quantico. Tailored, pristine, buttons polished to a mirror shine. It wasn't a replacement, it was a recognition. The Corps had sent a letter with the uniform. It read only, "Your silence spoke louder than any command." Semper Fidelis. Harold approached the memorial, slowly taking in the fresh coats of paint, the carefully replanted flowers, the new American flag, standing taller than before. He ran a gloved hand across the granite, stopping for a moment at one name in particular, a fellow Marine, a friend lost long ago. Then he looked to the far side of the wall where something new had been installed since the last time he stood there. It was a plaque, simple bronze mounted flush with the stone. The engraving was clean, firm, and clear to those who stood for us and still do. Harold stared at it for a long time. No smile, no salute, just a long, still moment of breath and memory. A few feet behind him, a boy stood with his father. The boy whispered, "Is that him?" The father nodded. "That's him." Harold turned just slightly, gave the boy a nod. Then he walked away. Because for Harold Becker, it had never been about the crowd. It was about standing when it mattered, even when no one else would. In a time when noise often drowns out meaning, Harold Becker showed us that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. His quiet strength reminded us that honor isn't just a medal or a memory. It's a choice we make every day. This story isn't only about a man in uniform. It's about what we stand for as a country: respect, courage, legacy. It challenges us to ask, in today's divided world, what do we still hold sacred? Some might argue this was just a protest gone too far. Others see it as a call to return to values we've let slip. What do you think? Should veterans have stronger protections at public events? Or does free speech take precedence, even at the cost of respect? We invite you, especially our older viewers who've lived through history, to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed a moment where honor was tested in public? What would you have done? Let's talk about it. Not with anger, but with understanding. And if this story touched you, reminded you of someone you love, or made you pause and think, please consider subscribing to our channel, hitting the like button, and sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful stand is the one taken in silence. Thank you for watching. And as always, we'll see you in the next story, where courage meets kindness and the quiet ones still lead the way.